Hi, Ngozi, good to see you.
Hi, Matthias. Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Wouldn't miss it.
Yeah. Morning, Gigi. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm so grateful that all of you could make it. And Caroline, thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you want to start now, Caroline, thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this launch event at the WTO, hosted jointly by the conveners of 3 separate ministerial statements on trade and environmental sustainability, plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, and fossil fuel subsidies. My name is Carolyn Deer-Burback. I'm the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, which is a partnership of the Graduate Institute and UNEP. Thank you to the co-conveners for the invitation to moderate this event. So the launch of the 3 ministerial statements today represents a landmark in the history of the WTO. Environment issues have been a challenging topic for members for much of the organization's first 25 years. So this event today is remarkable because it's a set of environmental issues, pressing crises that is bringing members together. So we're joined this morning by a number of trade ministers who will introduce the 3 separate statements, which you can find posted on the WTO webpage for this event. And that will occur in 3 distinct segments. This will then be followed by interventions from a range of stakeholder organizations, including leaders from international organizations, NGOs, and business organizations. But first, to kick off this event, I'm delighted to introduce the WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, to provide a keynote address. Dr. Ngozi, we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you, Caroline, very much. And ministers, excellencies, dear friends, thank you so much for coming, colleagues. Let me start by saying how excited I am and saying congratulations to the co-conveners. These congratulations are well deserved. The co-sponsors of these 3 ministerial statements are taking an important step forward on addressing key trade and environmental sustainability issues at the WTO. It's a very encouraging sign that so many ministers are joining us today and delivering messages. This event was supposed to have taken place during our 12th ministerial conference. As you know, we had to postpone MC12 because of the recent COVID-19 developments of Omicron. Disappointing as this was, work to respond to the challenges of our time, from the pandemic to the environmental crisis in our atmosphere and oceans, cannot and must not wait. You have managed to persevere, all of you participants and co-conveners of these initiatives, to push your work forward and send this clear political signal today that you see trade policy and the WTO as central components of your environmental sustainability efforts. It is truly a historic moment for the WTO. Environmental concerns were first discussed within the GATT as early as 1971, during the early days of the international environmental movement. But it was not until 1994 that leaders adopted the first decision, recognizing the, quote, mutual supportiveness, unquote, of international trade and environmental action, and created the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. There's too much at stake for us to wait decades more for results. Your ministerial statements must lead to action. Just last week, many of you were part of the conclusion of the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. I hope you take that as an inspiration for delivering results on environmental goods and services, sustainable supply chains, plastics pollution, fossil fuel subsidy reform, capacity building, and all other critical aspects of trade and environmental sustainability in your statements. When WTO members launched negotiations on trade and environment issues back in 2001, you were ahead of the curve. You had identified positive pathways for trade to support the environment, including by facilitating access to environmental goods and services. You also recognized the importance of addressing environmentally harmful subsidies and initiated what at the time were paths breaking negotiations on fisheries subsidies. Trade and the WTO are part of the solution to climate change and environmental degradation. That was the message I took to COP26 in Glasgow a few weeks ago. I always say that trade is about people, but the fact is that people, in particular the most vulnerable, are increasingly paying the price of environmental degradation. Problems of the global commons represent some of the biggest threats to the future prosperity and security of people around the world. Today, you are demonstrating that you want the WTO to play a positive role in addressing these problems. In recent years here, we have seen renewed interest, including from developing country members, in sharing experiences and ideas for using trade-related policies to address environmental challenges. This reflects the growing understanding among members that trade can and must act in support of achieving sustainable development outcomes for people around the world. Work in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment has directly informed the statements you launch. Let me also commend the participants in all three initiatives for involving external stakeholders in your work, civil society groups, business, and other international organizations. Drawing in the full range of stakeholders is vital for improving our understanding of the challenges and opportunities at the intersection between trade, environment, climate change, and sustainable development. It's very welcome to see that more than half of the 81 co-sponsors across the three statements are from developing countries. I encourage you to continue your efforts to further increase the number of developing and least developed countries in your initiatives. Inclusion of this kind is essential. Developing countries and least developed countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change and other environmental challenges. Every day we see this, from South Sudan to Fiji to the Caribbean to all over the globe. They have important innovations, ideas, needs, perspectives to bring to the table, so we must include them. The needs of poor and vulnerable countries underscore why investment, technical assistance, and capacity building, as well as just transition considerations, need to be integral elements of your discussions. As we know, environmental challenges are already complicating efforts to rebuild among the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a critical role for external support in their efforts to put the economies on sustainable development pathways. That is why at COP26, there was so much emphasis on developed countries fulfilling the pledge of $100 billion per year to help poor countries navigate the just transition. Let me also state that I'm disappointed that the Environmental Goods Agreement was suspended at the end of 2016. I understand there's still strong interest among many members to resume work on both environmental goods and services. I hope with the launch of these statements, there'll be a possibility for all of us to pick up on this vital work, which is expected of the WTO, especially in view of the results of COP26. I urge you all to take a pragmatic approach. Let's start with a reasonable list of goods and build upon that and see this as a living agreement that can be improved on over time. In conclusion, I want to say to ministers and delegations joining this event that you are reshaping the narrative around trade and environment. You are demonstrating to the world that trade is part of the solution for environment and climate change, not just part of the problem. I hope that ministers in particular will come together more often for dialogue and experience sharing on these critical issues of environment, climate, sustainable development, and change, and trade. This would help members build the trust and understanding necessary to make progress. Again, today is a historic step forward, but we're still at the start of this journey. To put ambition into action, you need to come back early in 2022 and develop the work programs, undertake the technical discussions, and formulate the proposals that will lead to tangible deliverables. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear this from me, because I'm always setting targets for deliverables, and I won't stop, not even with environment and climate change. I'm not trying to spoil your Christmas holidays by any means, but I really do want us to come back and get to work immediately on this important area. So as we celebrate the strong political signal you're sending today, let's remember that tomorrow the onus is on us to deliver results and trade, and show that trade and the WTO are key tools in achieving a sustainable and just transition. I know that we're up to this challenge. Thank you very much and have a wonderful session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngozi, for those excellent opening remarks and for setting the scene so well for what will follow. You've rightly mentioned that the fact that the launch was rescheduled today highlights the commitment of members to maintaining the momentum and moving forward on these issues. The three separate statements, reflect recognition of the impact of trade and trade policies on the environment and of environmental degradation on trade, and also the need for trade and trade policies to do more to support the shift towards sustainability. They also reflect recognition of the need for the multilateral trading system to be more responsive to environmental crises and sustainable development challenges that are really top 21st century global policy priorities. As you've noted, the three statements underline the importance of advancing inclusive and open discussions at the WTO on these topics, and the imperative for the WTO to contribute to the wider international cooperation that is needed to secure a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. The statements could really not be more timely from an environmental standpoint. As Dr. Ngozi has mentioned, we've just come out of the COP26 process. We've heard scientists, people in the streets, younger generations all over the world loudly demanding that we move forward on environmental challenges, not just of climate change, but also of nature, loss, and pollution, with a greater degree of urgency than ever before. So we're meeting at a time when the livelihoods and health of communities around the world are suffering from an onslaught of disasters like floods, droughts, and hurricanes due to accelerating climate change, from soil depletion, water and ecosystem degradation, from the loss of habitat, and from too much waste everywhere. And all of these environmental challenges have direct economic impacts, as well as social impacts on communities and on public health. And as Dr. Ngozi has highlighted, the impacts harm the poorest and vulnerable countries the most. The evidence is clear that these environmental crises impact the trading prospects of all nations. And responding to these challenges will require massive economic transformation around the world, coupled with a commitment to supporting just transitions. And this will take huge political efforts to foster the necessary international cooperation, especially at a time when so many governments are reeling from the COVID pandemic, which is already bringing their economies to their knees. So each of these statements is significant because they reflect an effort by members to grapple with environmental goals in the context of trade and economic interests. And this is what makes cooperation at the WTO so complex and also difficult, but also so worth pursuing. The governments are emphasizing the need to identify, seize, and foster new economic opportunities arising from more sustainable trade. And they also acknowledge the role that trade policies can play in regulating and reducing trade that is harmful to the environment, the climate, our economies, communities, and public health. So let us now move to the statements. Altogether, over 80 WTO members, around half of the WTO's membership, have co-sponsored one or more of the three statements. Important too, as Dr. Ngozi has mentioned, is that they reflect the diversity of the WTO's membership. Co-sponsors include developed, developing, and least developed economies, small, vulnerable economies, and small island developing states, alongside the world's largest trading nations. The co-sponsors of the statements have asked me to underline that these are three separate statements. Some members co-sponsor all three. Others have focused their engagement on one of the statements. Being a co-sponsor of one does not imply an endorsement of any other. Each statement represents a commitment of members to strengthen the multilateral system. Each seeks to catalyze and enable discussions that inform, complement, and support those that take place in the WTO's regular processes for decision-making and dialogue, like the Committee on Trade and Environment. And each statement underlines the importance of approaching environment and trade issues through a wider sustainable development lens, recognizing the economic and social challenges at hand for developing countries and least developed countries, and seeking ways to address these and support opportunities. They're also each committed to inclusiveness, openness, and transparency. Each is open to all WTO members to co-sponsor and to participate in their work, even in the absence of co-sponsorship. So finally, each statement reflects a hope that innovations in process at the WTO can help members move forward more swiftly and collaboratively in the multilateral framework and with the spirit of multilateralism on topics of shared interest to generate different kinds of outcomes. So the work ahead will be to ensure that members translate this hope, this potential, into meaningful outcomes. So we now turn to remarks from ministers on the 3 separate ministerial statements. Given the complications of the pandemic and moving this event online, we've had some changes to the speaker list and order. But first up, we will publicly launch this morning the statement on trade and environmental sustainability. So co-convened by Canada and Costa Rica, the process of structured discussions began in November 2020, just over a year ago, with 53 members. And today, the Ministerial counts 71 WTO co-sponsors, together representing over 80% of global trade. It's also attracted the participation of the 3 largest players in global trade and a diversity of WTO members. So to introduce this statement, I'm delighted to introduce Arif Virani, who is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business and Economic Development of Canada. Arif, you have the floor.
Hello everyone, my name is Arif Virani. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary to the Canadian Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business and Economic Development. It's a true pleasure to be able to speak as co-convener of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions to discuss this important issue for WTO members. Like all of you, we're very disappointed that we weren't able to meet in person at the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, which was postponed due to the developments of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we of course understand and support the decision that was taken, with everyone's safety and health in mind. Just a few weeks ago at COP26, world leaders agreed to accelerate action on climate change adaptation and mitigation. With the eyes of the world now turning to the WTO, it's time to show that this institution can meaningfully contribute to global efforts needed to respond to the many environmental sustainability challenges we face. The trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions were born out of the belief that international trade and trade policy can support our collective efforts to address these pressing climate challenges. The co-sponsors here today believe that sustainable development and protecting the environment are fundamental goals of the WTO. And we believe that sustainability should be a central issue for the WTO agenda. By adding an environmental lens to our trade discussions, we have the opportunity to push for inclusive and sustainable growth for all. While holding discussions is easier to do in person, we can be proud of what we've achieved despite the challenges during this pandemic. During our virtual TESSD meetings this year, we heard clearly from members about their priorities and their hopes for the future. Today we mark months of our sustained efforts for ambitious outcomes on this issue by launching our ministerial statement on trade and environmental sustainability. This statement acts as both a reflection on the work we've done and a commitment to the actions we will take to advance environmental priorities at the WTO. We can create new opportunities for environmentally sustainable trade, notably by identifying challenges and ambitious goals and examining the nexus between trade and the environment. We should also recognize the need for an inclusive approach that reflects the larger diversity of the WTO membership. The statement we're putting forward aims to reflect this diversity by addressing a variety of different topics, such as environmental goods and services, resource efficiency, capacity building, and technical assistance for developing and the least developed members. By reflecting on a broad range of topics, we believe there will be room for all members to see their interests reflected in our discussions. We hope that our efforts will result in tangible outcomes that will enhance and support the work on environmental issues that we've already started. We're very pleased that the statement has attracted 71 endorsements, but there's always room to grow, as trade and environmental issues concern all WTO members around the world. For that reason, Canada strongly encourages all WTO members to participate in the TESSD. As co-convener for these discussions, Canada sees the interests of members for ensuring that the WTO has the tools to tackle climate change, and we share the same determination to use everything we have in our power to address environmental and climate challenges. The statement we are launching today marks an important moment for collective action. It's the beginning of the next phase of our work on trade and the environment, one in which we intensify our work and consider concrete ways that we can advance our trade and environmental goals within the WTO. I look forward to seeing what we can do to address these issues head on together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Virani, for that very uplifting introduction to the statement. And also, I think on behalf of all of the co-sponsors, we can thank Canada for your leadership in co-convening this initiative and getting the statement this far ahead. So it's now my honor to turn the floor to His Excellency Andrés Valenciano, who's Costa Rica's Minister of Foreign Trade, who is also the co-convener with Canada of this initiative. Minister, you have the floor.
Good morning, Excellencies, fellow ministers, heads of delegations, permanent representatives, delegates, secretariat, and stakeholders. Thank you for joining us this morning on this historic and symbolic event. Dear friends, November 13, 2020 marked a breakthrough in the history of this organization. A group of willing, ambitious, and forward-looking members established these structured discussions in the middle of a pandemic, with the eyes of the world watching how the WTO was going to address environmental and climate issues, and with the impending concern on how we were going to build back greener, better, and flexible platform after the COVID-19 crisis. The inclusive, open, and flexible platform offered by TESSD to discuss these issues filled this space and provided this opportunity. A year later, we face a challenging reality not only with the health crisis, but also the economic and social crises it has triggered, all together with climate change and its long-term effects. Yet, there is still hope, and the trade community has stepped up. Today, for the first time at the WTO, 3 member-led initiatives focused on trade and sustainability issues have come together as one and made it possible for a wide diversity of members to collectively send the world the message that now, more than ever, responsibility and political will has to be at the center of the agenda, and the organization will be able to deliver. I am honored to be part of this event as a co-convener along with Minister Eng and the co-sponsor to present the Ministerial Statement on Trade and Environmental Sustainability. This is a significant milestone for the multilateral trading system, as there has never been a ministerial statement on the environment. On this occasion, we have over 80% of the world's trade represented in TESSD, and this is no small thing. Our planet has raised its voice. There's no time to spare. The latest events have put into perspective the fragility of our natural resources and biodiversity. Climate shocks disrupt not only the way we live, but for our purposes, the way we trade. We know that climate change impacts the supply of essential goods, logistics, supply chains, agriculture, food, and crop security. However, as policymakers, we must acknowledge and address the ways through which trade can enhance mitigation and enable adaptation to these climate shocks. Multilateral trade policy actions not only support economic recovery, it lifts incomes and incentivizes investment, and they can support the global climate agenda and sustainable development goals. In the midst of this crisis, the WTO must be ready to deliver concrete proposals for addressing climate change and other global environmental challenges through trade policies at the multilateral level. The structured discussion's objective is precisely to be this platform of exchange and debates where we can reflect and share experiences and realities of the members and encourage developing and least developing countries to share on this collaborative exercise and build an agenda on trade and environmentally related ideas and projects. Under this premise, we have been able to increase the number of co-sponsors to 70 as of today, half of which are developing and least developed country members. This is proof of the inclusive and open character of these discussions. From our perspective, as co-conveners, Costa Rica has worked tirelessly together with Canada to promote frank and transparent dialogues with members and stakeholders. We have dedicated the last year to find common understandings among other peers to share on the diverse views and positions of the issues on our agenda, not only because it is asked from our role, but also because in our national capacity, this initiative is very relevant to advance our trade and environmental interests. Costa Rica's Green Trade Agenda gives the idea that trade must deliver sustainability, and in turn, sustainability must deliver trade. This virtuous cycle must be in the driver of development moving forward. That is the reason we are founding members of this initiative, and we are part of the negotiations of an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. With other 5 like-minded countries covering disciplines on trade liberalization or environmental goods and services, eco-labeling, and harmful fossil fuel subsidies. We expect TESD to be the first step forward towards building the political will required for reaching consensus on the pillars that must guide the WTO's trade environment agenda. Our work program can also positively contribute to implementing the Glasgow Climate Pact, particularly regarding ensuring just transitions that promote sustainable development, eradication of poverty, and the creation of decent work and quality jobs, including through making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse emissions and climate-resilient development. To conclude, I want to thank each and every single co-sponsor that has joined this trailblazing effort and encourage those who haven't joined to do so. We look forward to all the exciting discussions we will have in the coming year. There's plenty to do, but more importantly, there's plenty we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Valenciano. I think you'll all agree that the initiative is lucky to have a minister with such energy behind the scenes driving this work forward. Your comments have really underlined that the TESSD statement is not only an affirmation of the importance of the environment agenda to the WTO, but it's also a statement of intention and aspiration of work to come. So in 2022, the statement and work program set a solid framework for more intensive and detailed work on exactly how governments are going to work together to tackle this nexus and how to do so inclusively. So we turn now to the second statement to be publicly launched this morning, which is focused on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. So the informal dialogue on this topic was launched in November 2020 by 16 WTO members, galvanized by a group of developing countries led by China and Fiji. It's now shepherded by 6 co-conveners: Australia, Barbados, China, Ecuador, Fiji, and Morocco. The meetings in 2021 and the work going forward is open to all WTO members, as well as multiple stakeholders. So the ministerial statement launching today has 67 co-sponsors from across the WTO's membership. It's a remarkable statement because it includes such a diverse set of countries, including some of the world's biggest producers and traders of plastics. Indeed, taken together, the co-sponsors of this statement represent around 75% of the more than $1 trillion a year global trade in plastics. So to introduce this statement, I'm delighted to welcome ministers representing 3 of the 6 co-conveners of the IDP. To begin, I turn the floor to His Excellency Wang Shuwen, who is Vice Minister of Commerce of China. You have the floor.
DG Evila, Dr. Birkbeck, colleagues, good morning. First of all, I am pleased to participate in today's meeting on behalf of Minister Wang Wentao of China, and I would like to share my views and observations on the IDP ministerial statement. The rising environmental, health, and economic costs related to plastic pollution have increasingly become a common concern for the international community. The pandemic has shown how vulnerable the world is before natural disasters. It has also highlighted the urgency to tackle global environmental issues and the importance of achieving sustainable development. Plastic pollution causes environmental pollution and health risks, which, if not properly managed, will spread with international trade. China used to bear a heavy burden. Before 2019, China imported some 50 million tons of solid waste annually, putting our environment under grave pressure. President Xi Jinping of China has stressed on many occasions that the environment is crucial for the well-being of the people. He has also stressed that clear waters and green mountains are as valuable as mountains of gold and silver. In recent years, the government of China has adopted a series of measures to gradually reduce, restrict, and prohibit the use of disposable plastics, fully ban the importation of solid waste. China has also promoted recyclable and degradable alternatives and has turned more plastic wastes into useful resources and energy. During the 14th five-year plan period, that is between 2021 and 2025, China will redouble its efforts in preventing and addressing plastic pollution. Our target is a notable decline of disposable plastics consumption by 2022 and the effective control of plastic pollution by 2025. China organized the first workshop on plastic pollution together with Morocco and Sri Lanka in Geneva in November 2019. On November 17, 2020, China and Fiji held the first informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. Today, it is really heartening to see that the IDP Ministerial Statement has been launched officially. China believes that the significance of the IDP initiative lies in its relevance. First, trade policies are a key area for tackling plastic pollution and promoting recycling of sustainable plastics. The IDP represents the WTO's concrete action on the trade policy front to respond to the environmental challenges of global concern. Second, the IDP is committed to responding effectively to the concerns of developing members, and in particular, LDCs and small island members, which suffer the most from environmental degradation. Of the over 100 measures targeting trade in plastics for environmental reasons notified by the WTO members, 80% are taken by developing members or LDC members. Thirdly, the IDP embodies the concept of trade for people. The poorest and the most vulnerable benefit the most from environmental improvement. This is one of the things that China has learned from its environmental governance experiences. The IDP initiative, which was initiated by 8 co-sponsors, now has 67 co-sponsoring members from different regions and at various development stages. We should try to get more members on board for more extensive cooperation and more substantive outcomes. To this end, the IDP should try to bring more members joining in our discussion. The IDP should cooperate closely with other international organizations such as the United Nations Environment Programme, UNCTAD, OECD, and the World Economic Forum in a bid to carry out more discussions about trade and plastic pollution reduction. The IDP should focus on best practices in trade policy, work to deliver specific outcomes on trade policies contributing to plastic pollution prevention and control. The IDP also needs to strengthen support for developing members in capacity building and technical assistance. To conclude, we expect the WTO to play its unique role in helping members to come up with more coordinated, consistent, and effective trade measures and foster bonds between trade, environment, and development for addressing today's environmental challenges and for a sustainable future of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vice Minister Wang, for those remarks and also for China's leadership and spirit of cooperation in pulling together the group of members working on this statement and being a constant voice of support for this work. So joining us next, I have the pleasure to introduce His Excellency Julio José Prado, who is the Minister for Production, Foreign Trade, Investment and Fisheries of Ecuador. You have the floor.
Buenos días, soy Julio José Prado, Ministro de Producción, Comercio Exterior, Inversiones y Pesca del Ecuador. Un saludo a todos los asistentes, en especial a la Directora General de la Organización Mundial del Comercio, quien nos acompaña el día de hoy. Mi agradecimiento a quienes han desarrollado este espacio para dialogar sobre asuntos de comercio, desarrollo sostenible y ambiente, entre los cuales destaca la contaminación producida por los plásticos y sobre el comercio de plásticos ambientalmente sostenibles. En esa línea, Ecuador impulsa una política nacional proactiva en materia de economía circular a través de metas y acciones específicas que garantizan la eficiencia de recursos y una producción más limpia. Además, a escala internacional, nuestro país lidera en Naciones Unidas el combate a la contaminación por plásticos y dentro de la OMC patrocinamos y somos coordinadores del diálogo informal sobre la contaminación por plásticos y comercio. Por lo que, junto con Australia, China, Barbados, Fiji y Marruecos, hemos desarrollado una declaración ministerial que es endosada por 67 miembros y que se realizó con una importante contribución de múltiples actores. Nuestro diálogo busca frenar esta creciente problemática, avanzar hacia una economía más circular y plantear alternativas al plástico que sean técnicas y ecológicamente viables, entre otros que exigen una coordinación con organismos internacionales. Pues frente a un desafío global, hay que actuar con respuestas globales, acciones coordinadas y participativas. El rol de la cooperación en temas comerciales es indispensable, si se considera que el plástico es del 5% del comercio internacional. Por ello, nuestros esfuerzos en la OMC pueden contribuir de manera sustantiva al proceso que lleva adelante la Asamblea de Naciones Unidas sobre el Medio Ambiente, que se reunirá en febrero del 2022 para propiciar un trabajo vinculante que aborde esta compleja temática, sobre la cual se han pronunciado favorablemente 156 naciones. Termino agradeciendo a los múltiples actores que han aportado con sus visiones, así como a mis colegas con quienes Ecuador se hermana por esta causa. En esa línea, es un gusto anunciar oficialmente la integración del Ecuador a los debates estructurados sobre el comercio y la sostenibilidad ambiental. Nuestra participación en los temas de comercio y medio ambiente nacen de nuestra convicción de que un Ecuador más competitivo es definitivamente un Ecuador más sostenible.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister Prado, for those remarks, and really inspiring to hear a trade minister speak so forcefully about the importance of environment issues to the economy of your country. And also thank you for your leadership on the IDP. Oh, sorry, I've got the translation on off. Sorry. So I'd now like to turn to the third speaker on the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, who is the Honourable Dan Tehan, who is Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment of Australia, Australia being one of the 6 co-conveners of this initiative. Minister Tehan, you have the floor.
It's a privilege to be involved in this event representing a seminal moment for the World Trade Organisation. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be there with you live. Today, members have come together to launch efforts to address issues vital to our future. Today, we jointly recognise that trade has an important role to play in environmental sustainability, and we demonstrate our readiness to take action. We have been having a tough time at the WTO. The most recent postponement of MC12 was a setback. It would have been easy in the wake of the postponement to drop the ball on critical initiatives like this. Instead, we rallied and have come together to drive progress and outcomes, to show the international community that the WTO is serious about contributing meaningfully to global problems. I would like to congratulate my fellow ministers on their resilience and effort. Australia is a proud coordinator of the Informal Dialogue on Plastics Pollution, IDP, and I am honoured to have this opportunity to speak about the IDP along with my esteemed colleagues, Minister Prado from Ecuador and Vice Minister Wang from China. Before turning to the IDP, let me say how equally excited I am about the launch of the Structured Discussions on Environmental Sustainability, TESSD. Australia is a proud co-sponsor of the TESSD initiative. We are looking forward to working with members to find trade-enhancing ways the WTO can contribute to environmental sustainability, including expanding trade in the environmental goods, services and technologies that are needed to support sustainability, and working to address harmful agricultural subsidies. The global agricultural industry accounts for around 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. If we are serious about addressing the environment at the WTO, we need to honestly address the climate impacts of agricultural subsidies. Now on to the very significant problem of plastics. Plastic debris have been detected worldwide in all major marine habitats. It is thought that every day approximately 8 million pieces of plastic pollution find their way into our oceans. Scientists have even discovered microplastics embedded deep in the Arctic ice, and scientific estimates suggest that by 2050 the plastics in our ocean will outweigh the fish. It is clear that global trade plays a significant role across the entire plastic supply chain. Plastic pollution is not a problem that can be solved by any one country. We must work within the WTO system to support and complement intergovernmental efforts to reduce plastic pollution and consider how we can foster the right business environment to encourage new technologies to prevent pollution from entering our oceans. I would like to thank China and Fiji for their leadership in starting the discussion on plastics pollution. The IDP has enabled trade policy specialists to work with environmental organisations, and it has enabled developing and developed countries alike to work together on this serious problem. I am pleased to introduce this statement, which recalls the Marrakesh Agreement, which recognises the responsibility for trade to contribute to sustainable development. It recognises the impact that plastic pollution has on economies, the environment, and particularly vulnerable WTO members, including developing countries and small island developing states. It sets out our commitment to share experiences and identify best practices to reduce plastics pollution through trade-related mechanisms, and identify how we can shift away from environmentally harmful plastic products to alternative solutions. And it recognises the role that technical development has in enabling the transition to greater sustainability. Congratulations to all of the co-sponsors of the IDP and the other environmental statements. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can achieve in 2022.
Thank you, Minister T. Han. So I think with those three interventions, you have a great overview of the goals of the IDP and its promise. I would encourage you all to take a look at the statements that are there on the WTO's website. And you'll see in this case, a great contribution of this statement is it identifies very concrete opportunities and areas for cooperation on trade and trade policy that would help reduce plastic pollution, while emphasising the importance for members that this work complements and supports the work in the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment, and that there is coherence and complementarity with wider international efforts that we all know are underway on this important topic. So the next item on our agenda is the Ministerial Statement on Fossil Fuel Subsidies, co-sponsored by 45 WTO members. The importance of this topic was reinforced at COP26, driven by the pressure to act with greater urgency to keep the 1.5-degree pathway alive. Governments committed in the Glasgow Climate Pact to accelerate efforts to phase down inefficient fossil fuel subsidies while recognising the need for support towards a just transition. So this effort to spur dialogue on action and fossil fuel subsidy reform has been spearheaded by New Zealand, and so it's fitting that the Honourable Damien O'Connor, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, will now introduce the statement. Minister O'Connor, you have the floor.
Tēnā koutou katoa and greetings. I'm pleased to join you virtually today to launch the MC12 Joint Ministerial Statement on Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. While the Ministerial Conference could not go ahead as planned, we are determined to continue to make progress. The Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Statement is co-sponsored by at least 45 WTO members from a range of developed and developing countries and from many regions. This broad support is a clear indication that the trade community wants to contribute to global efforts to address climate change. It also reflects the momentum we have been building over the past year. In November, New Zealand and 20 other APEC economies made progress to turn the tide on fossil fuel subsidies in the region. While it will take time to remove such entrenched policies, we were pleased to reach consensus to stop the expansion of such regressive and damaging policies. Then, a week later at COP26 in Glasgow, 196 United Nations members explicitly acknowledged for the first time that fossil fuel subsidies must be reformed if we are to stay on the 1.5-degree pathway. It is vital that we shift from business as usual as soon as possible. Today's co-sponsors recognise the adverse trade, social and environmental impacts of fossil fuel subsidies. Today, we are advancing the conversation on reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies at the WTO. Fossil fuel subsidies distort trade and investment decisions, making it harder for renewable energy to compete. Subsidies are a well-established trade issue. It makes sense to pursue fossil fuel subsidy reform within the rules-based architecture and transparency frameworks of the WTO. Worryingly, fossil fuel subsidies have continued to increase in the past decade, costing governments approximately $500 billion in public funds each year. To be clear, these subsidies work against our efforts to address climate change by artificially lowering the cost of fossil fuels and encouraging their ongoing use. This is the opposite of what we should be doing. While these subsidies are environmentally damaging to the planet, there's also the opportunity cost of what public money could undoubtedly be better used for elsewhere. Now, as we look to the future beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, we have the opportunity to implement climate-resilient and sustainable economic policies. The co-sponsors of the statement aim to seek the rationalisation and phase-out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption along a clear timeline. The statement recognises that reform needs to take into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise possible adverse impacts on development in a way that helps protect poor and affected communities. It has never been a one-size-fits-all approach. This is a fundamental principle that will continue to guide our efforts. The statement makes explicit what we see as the next key step, sharing information and experiences to continue to develop a supportive international setting for addressing these subsidies and to assist domestic reform efforts. As co-sponsors, we intend to explore and elaborate concrete,
options for advancing this issue within the WTO in advance of MC13. We have set ourselves a timeframe so that we can move towards action in a coherent and transparent manner. New Zealand also welcomes the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions and the informal dialogue on plastics pollution initiatives, which we are very pleased to co-sponsor. We look forward to engaging actively across these complementary initiatives. I want to thank all the co-sponsoring WTO members for your support for the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Ministerial Statement. Together, we will demonstrate that trade policy can make a difference. Through our efforts, we will support progress towards a cleaner future that contributes to the Marrakesh Agreement objective of sustainable development, seeking to protect and preserve the environment we all live in.
Thank you, Minister O'Connor, and for reminding us of the importance of complementarity and synergy between international environmental regimes and international economic regimes, such as those administered at the World Trade Organization. I turn the floor now to Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, who's the European Union's Commissioner for Trade. He'll provide remarks on all three statements.
Dear Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, dear ministers, let me start by thanking you all for investing your time and energy to make this event a reality. The European Union is a proud co-sponsor of these joint statements, which send a strong political signal. I hope that many more will join in the future. Climate change and environmental degradation are among the greatest collective challenges we face as a global community. Every policy must do its part. Trade policy is no exception. This is why we have made climate action and sustainability a central part of the new EU trade strategy. And we are not alone. Many countries around the world are bringing forward strong policy initiatives aimed at greening trade. But multilateral cooperation has a big part to play. Global trade rules must be shaped to help provide a global response. This is why these joint statements on climate and environmental issues matter. They each represent an important milestone. They are inclusive, representing all regions of the globe and all levels of economic development. They take stakeholders' views into account. Indeed, I'm glad that many stakeholders are participating in today's event. So let me address each of the three statements. First, on trade and environmental sustainability. With this statement, we agree to tackle climate change while at the same time promoting sustainable supply chains and a circular economy. I'm particularly keen to explore how trade in environmental goods and services can support these goals. Trade can really make a difference here by accelerating the uptake of climate-smart goods, services, and technologies. Because every country and region must have a fair chance for green and sustainable economic transformation. For this to happen, we will need to do preparatory work. There are technical and regulatory details to address. We also need to find ways to assess the environmental impact of products at all stages of the supply chain. These are complex questions. Ideally, all the building blocks should be in place by the next WTO Ministerial MC13. By that time, participants should be able to decide whether there is merit in starting and joining negotiations. Second, on plastics. We are committing to building a better understanding of the global plastics trade. This will help us to identify trade measures to reduce plastic pollution. These efforts can inform the future negotiation on the Global Plastics Agreement. The EU is keen to launch these talks with other partners in the United Nations Environment Assembly next February. Finally, on fossil fuel subsidies. Tackling this issue is critical for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I expect work on promoting subsidy transparency in the WTO will be the first step. This can anchor our work in the WTO and pave the way for future disciplines on subsidies. To conclude, these statements are only a starting point, and we have a long way to go. But as we say in Latvia, a good start is already half the job. I believe that climate and environmental issues must be tackled in a holistic way, not in silos. As trade ministers, we have a shared responsibility in this respect. This is why I recently initiated the idea of Trade Ministers' Climate Coalition. I believe this could make a big difference in building political momentum, helping to support the work we launched today. Finally, let me once again thank you all for the great efforts you have made. We are concluding 2021 on a very positive note. Let us pledge to make 2022 even better. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Vice President. So the remarks from ministers speaking from their capitals today is a reminder that work on more integrated approaches to environment and trade must begin with greater policy coherence among environment, development, and trade policymaking processes within capitals. This must extend to stronger cooperation across different parts of the international system, drawing on the expertise of stakeholders. So this is a great transition to the second part of our session this morning, where we'll hear perspectives from stakeholders on these statements, the opportunities they present, and the priorities ahead. To kick us off, I turn the floor first to Mr. Matthias Gorman, who is Secretary General of the OECD. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Director General, dear Ngozi, ministers, ambassadors, distinguished colleagues. The OECD warmly welcomes the ministerial statements on trade and environmental sustainability, on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, and on fossil fuel subsidies. These are important milestones in promoting environmentally sustainable trade, which will drive stronger, more resilient growth, more jobs, and higher living standards, while also helping to reduce pollution and combat climate change. Because we have a collective responsibility to act, and to act now, to counter the devastating impact of environmental degradation on our economies and our societies. And for this, we need to design and implement trade and sustainability policies that are more effective, less costly, less market distorting, and less environmentally harmful. Finding common ground will require investments in transparency and knowledge sharing, along with support to help all countries improve resilience and ensure a fair transition. For example, our latest analysis derived from the OECD Green Recovery Database found that 10% of recovery spending across OECD, EU, and key partner countries has either mixed or negative impacts on the environment. Why we would make any such public investments with negative impacts on the environment, is very difficult to explain. So much more needs to be done if we are to drive transformational changes in line with commitments made at COP26 on climate and at COP15 on biodiversity. And these ministerial statements build strong momentum for these endeavors. The OECD, as always, stands ready to support the implementation of these statements through data and analysis to inform and shape smart, evidence-based policies which support the net zero transition, help foster innovation, and help promote open markets. Let me just focus on, quickly on three ways we can support your important work. Firstly, we are working to show how trade underpins the circular economy and how trade reforms can promote a net zero world. We are tracking both the trade in green goods and services and the barriers to that trade to help make the case for reforms to ensure that green goods and services can be available worldwide. A global trade in environmental goods increased by 52.8% between 2007 and 2019. But due to continued higher tariffs, developing economies do not benefit as much as they could and as they should from this increase. We help drive and support a more ambitious, effective, and globally coordinated action on climate change. We've launched and started to deliver on the International Programme for Action on Climate, And we propose a new initiative to help facilitate over time an appropriately ambitious, multilaterally agreed and globally more coherent and better coordinated approach to the pricing of emissions. Building on the success of our inclusive framework on international tax reform, we propose to work with the IMF and the WTO on a multilateral approach to ensure individual jurisdictions can lift their level of ambition and effort on climate to the level required to get to net zero emissions, while maintaining to the greatest extent possible a global level playing field for trade, avoiding unfair trade distortions and competitiveness tensions and carbon leakage implications. We're also focused on helping to build more resilient and sustainable global value chains through our tools, such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. And we support multilateral trade negotiations by improving transparency across countries. Second, we provide data on the whole life cycle of plastics in our Global Plastics Outlook and track and publish government measures to control transboundary movements of plastic waste. We also identify best practices to address ghost fishing gear, a major source of ocean plastic pollution, in addition to measuring fisheries subsidies. Finally, we are tackling environmentally harmful policies by defining, identifying, and tracking government subsidies for fossil fuels, agriculture, fisheries, and industry. This helps to better understand the real cost of such policies and to make them more effective, less market distorting, and less harmful to the environment. Because inefficient government support or subsidies not only have a negative impact on our collective efforts to achieve net zero emissions, but also on our biodiversity, water, and air quality. In closing, let me offer my warm congratulations for the adoption of the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. This is a major achievement. Actions by WTO members representing over 90% of global services trade will support people and companies, especially small and medium enterprises working in the services economy to recover from the impact of the COVID pandemic. We have estimated that annual cost savings from reduced red tape and increased transparency could amount to $150 billion US globally, which is great news for exporters of environment-related services. You can count on the OECD to continue to fully support you in meeting all of the challenges ahead. Thank you so much again for inviting me.
Thank you, Matthias, and I can see Dr. Ngozi nodding there. I think we're very grateful for your offer of support to this work and for taking the time to be with us today. Our next intervention is from Inger Andersen, who is the Executive Director of UNEP, the UN agency that is the voice of the global environment. Inger, you have the floor.
We must almost halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to have any chance at holding global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We must slow the biodiversity and nature loss to support peace, prosperity, and health. And we must stop and clean up that toxic trail of pollution to save lives, millions of lives, each year. The three statements we've heard today strike at very important drivers of the triple planetary crisis: the climate crisis, the nature and biodiversity loss crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. The Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussion Statement provides a space for WTO members to discuss how trade policy can mitigate and adapt to climate change and reverse biodiversity loss. And with regards to biodiversity, therefore, this means reaching conclusions on the negotiations on fisheries subsidies so that our fish stocks can thrive. The statement on fossil fuel subsidies targets one of the biggest barriers to renewable energy. These subsidies encourage greenhouse gas emissions and wasteful consumption and drive down the price of primary plastics, adding to the plastic pollution crisis. And the statement on plastics encourages the exploration of ways trade can promote the transition to a circular economy for plastics. I was particularly pleased to see references to the Basel Convention and growing momentum amongst member states for meaningful action on plastics pollution at the next United Nations Environment Assembly in February 2022. We need to be clear on the full range of consequences of plastic pollution and act at source to address them all. I welcome the 3 statements. I encourage every WTO member state to get involved, not just in each individual work stream, but in bringing all of them together, because these challenges are intertwined. UNEP and the multilateral environmental agreement that we administer, we are here to help. We can contribute environmental science, data, technological information, and integrated assessment methodologies. We can provide capacity building to WTO members. We can work with partner organizations to enable the business sector to adopt sustainable initiatives in related sectors. Now, trade has been an essential part of human existence for millennia, but how and what we trade needs serious review, not just because of the negative impacts which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and nature loss, but because the potential of trade in sustainable goods and much needed technology. So again, I welcome these 3 statements and look forward to working with WTO members to put them into practice.
Well, thank you, Inga, for reminding us of the urgency of the task at hand, and also for setting out the many ways in which UNEP and the work of the environmental community can help contribute to these efforts at the WTO, and indeed will be vital to making sure that they are environmentally credible, and also that we seize the opportunities that are there for businesses and countries to trade more sustainably. So with that, I now turn the floor to Pamela Coke-Hamilton, who is the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. Pamela, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and good morning to everybody, Excellencies, especially DG Akonjo-Iweala. Thank you so much for your leadership on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I warmly congratulate WTO members on the launch of the joint ministerial statements on the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, and fossil fuel subsidy reform. These joint ministerial statements send a strong signal of political commitment to leverage trade as a contributor to addressing the climate, pollution, and biodiversity crises. We know that there's a clear role for trade policy to play in enabling countries to meet their Paris Agreement commitments and adapt to climate change. We have a menu of policy options that support the transition to a 1.5 Celsius global economy. Liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services will enable the faster deployment of technologies that reduce carbon intensity of manufacturing, allow more efficient use of water in agriculture, and support accessing adaptation services. At ITC, our clients are SMEs. SMEs in developing countries face the most severe impacts of climate change. Adaptation to climate risks is a business priority for our clients. Trade and business policy reform will facilitate access to the technology and finance required. What's more, SMEs can provide innovative solutions to the climate crisis. On November 23rd, we were proud to host the final round of the Green to Compete Youth Ecopreneur Awards that showcased the winning innovations from 650 applications in energy, waste, and water. This award highlights that the private sector has many of the solutions to the climate and biodiversity crises at its fingertips. But, and there's a big but, the ecopreneurs need the right incentives and rewards to enable the scaling up required. These incentives come in the form of the business and trade policies that are found in the ministerial commitments. The statements issued in Geneva offer stakeholders a useful indication of members' needs to move from prioritization to action and to impact on the ground. ITC stands ready through the delivery of Green Aid for Trade to support the process of engagement here in Geneva and to respond to members' needs on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you also, Pamela, for that commitment of support, and also for your work to engage developing countries and particularly small businesses in developing countries. So this agenda is one that can also work for them. I would note, just for those who are listening to be aware, we started about 5 minutes late, so we probably will run about 5 minutes over, but I'm doing my best to keep us on time this morning. So next up, we have Peter Woodis, who's the Senior Director for Energy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline, Dr. Ngozi, and all the dignitaries on the call. It's been incredibly heartening from an NGO perspective to hear this morning of the commitments to the issues around environment and sustainable development, and from the ministers and from others on how they've made sure that the urgency of the challenges we face are being taken into account. But of course, in true NGO fashion, we don't want to spend any time on congratulation. We want to ask straight away, what are the next steps to support implementation going forward? If we start with the IDP, the plastics regime, I think it's pretty clear what the environmental problems are in plastics. And I think we have an increasingly good understanding around supply chains, around consumption, around disposal routes, either controlled or uncontrolled. We know as well that the international movement of plastics are key, the linkages are key, but I don't think we yet have a very clear role of what exactly is the positive role that trade and trade policy can play, and what are those particular mechanisms which can be used. And in 2022, ISD, along with partners, proposes to work in a similar way as we have been with the fisheries subsidies negotiations, to undertake analysis, dialogues, issue briefs, and close contact with delegates from WTO membership. And the objective, we think, for next year is to identify very clearly what the role trade policy can play in managing the plastic problem, how it can play it, and the role there for the WTO and the wider Geneva community. Moving on to TESSD, we've been honoured as an NGO to have been part of the TESSD process at various parts as we've gone through, and to be consulted around it. Clearly, there are a very wide range of issues here, some of which we as an institute can help with. I mentioned agriculture, clean energy, adaptation, standards, fisheries, links between trade and other international agreements and law. But we're an international NGO, we're based in Geneva. There are a whole range of other NGOs and other organizations around the world, which we think it's imperative to bring into this TESSD process as much as we can going forward, as quickly as we can. We think that those stakeholders and their expertise are essential to make TESSD work both technically and politically. And we are, of course, available to help with that as we can. And then lastly, the issue of fossil fuel subsidies. I think the inclusion of the statement today in the WTO sort of completes the set. We now have statements, high-level commitments on subsidies, fossil fuel subsidy reform at the G20, at APEC, at the G7, under the SDGs. We note the SDG 12C1 and its reporting requirements, and of course, most lately at the UNFCCC during COP26 in Glasgow. So we have kind of the full set of high-level commitments that we need. We also have an ongoing discussion about whether there needs to be end dates added to those. And the G7 mentioned 2025 as an end date for fossil fuel subsidies reform recently. That's useful as a target and to encourage attention. But I think beyond the high level, what we now need is the next level of specific commitments that can be made on fossil fuel subsidies. And here, I think the WTO has a very, very strong role to play, because it's moving into classic WTO territory of prohibitions, exceptions, and SDT. Some fossil fuel subsidies need to be removed right now. And here we're looking at coal, particularly at upstream oil and gas, and at transport fuels. Others are needed. Other fossil fuel subsidies have important welfare benefits for the poor and vulnerable. And here exceptions are indicated where there are no alternatives, and potentially through SDT measures. But it's pretty clear that the WTO can play a very strong leading role in crafting this next level of commitments. And again, we at ISD and its Global Subsidies Initiative stand ready to support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So I will turn swiftly now to Sean Doherty, who is the head of international trade and investment at the World Economic Forum. Sean.
Oh, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting the World Economic Forum to join the launch today. So I'd like to applaud the members who are launching these statements, and also all the individuals who've worked so hard to get us here. However, I think it's also my role to immediately encourage you to do more and also to offer our help where that's useful. So we especially applaud the call for voluntary actions and partnerships. It's clear that waiting for agreement by everybody on everything is not the right approach. We do need to take action now. And so hopefully these initiatives will help provide the coordination which can accelerate that. Now, WTO members participating in the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Statement represent a large proportion of global CO2 emissions. So you are a group with significant power to accelerate climate action through trade. We're excited to provide public-private multi-stakeholder support through our Climate Trade Zero program in the first instance. And we think we can help bring regional perspectives, including the needs of developing country firms, to the fore. And we hope to help prioritize those steps which have the greatest impact. We see that action is needed along the supply chain, and we are looking to the Stockholm Plus 50 gathering in a few months as a milestone towards that. On plastic pollution and trade, we have a series of country assessments underway, and we are very keen to hear from other countries who would like to participate in those. On fossil fuel subsidies, very frankly, there's little we can add. Fossil fuel subsidies are harmful and should end. And the group of members supporting this initiative needs to be expanded. We also hope WTO members can soon reach a deal on other environmental topics on your agenda, like eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies and addressing distortionary agricultural support. Thank you again for the opportunity to work with you, and we look forward to supporting in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean. I would now be delighted to introduce Rebecca Grinspan, who is the Secretary General of UNCTAD. Thank you so much for joining us live this morning.
Thank you very much. And let me send greetings to Ngozi and to Pamela that are here with us. Thank you, dear colleagues and friends, and all the rest of the panelists and excellencies that are with us here today. Really is an honor to address you as Secretary General of UNCTAD in this joint event on trade and sustainability. As I have mentioned in the past, much hinges on this ministerial conference. And so I take this opportunity, dear Ngozi, to wish the WTO and all ministers present the greatest success in the days ahead. In the context of the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, much effort has been put not only in understanding the link between the trade system and the climate policy, but in finding ways to promote them both in an inclusive way. This indeed was the case in UNCTAD 15, our recent ministerial conference on trade and development, where member countries recognized that sustainable trade will be key in producing sustainable development. So this ministerial statement on trade and environmental sustainability, currently co-sponsored by more than 60 members, reiterates the importance of expanding the opportunities for environmentally, and I quote, environmentally sustainable trade in an inclusive and transparent way that reflects the circumstances of the diversity of the WTO's membership and their specific development needs. I end the quote. So this remembers the sustainability will only be achieved if measures are feasible, equitable, and effective to all. COP26 has given the world a new global agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, and implementing this agreement will require unprecedented levels of cooperation in economic and trade policy. Supporting the implementation of NDCs, energy transitions in developing countries, like was said before, trade and environmental goods and services, climate adaptation and economic diversification, deployment of carbon neutral technologies and nature-based solutions are all areas where the multilateral trade system has a big role to play. 3 initiatives are presented at MC12 that require increased cooperation. The joint ministerial statement on fossil fuel subsidies, the informal dialogue on plastic pollution, and the trade environmental sustainability. The joint ministerial statement on fossil fuels subsidy reform based in the Glasgow Pact to phase down coal and phase out fossil fuels subsidies. We have to remember these are 2 key issues that had never been expressly mentioned in a decision at climate talks before. So this is very important, yes? And they will require huge efforts and ambition towards COP26. A second initiative is the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmental sustainable plastic trade. Our estimates put the value of trade in plastics at $1 trillion per year. This constitutes 5% of total merchandise trade. It's huge. Sadly, however, approximately 76% of all plastic produced between 1950 and 2017 has become plastic waste, leading to a massive environmental problem both at land and at sea. And finally, the initiative that has to be highlighted is trade and environmental sustainability, building consensus on how we can make trade part of the solution remains a significant challenge. A fair, transparent, and inclusive dialogue will be essential for success. UNCTAD hopes to bring to this discussion the developing countries' perspective and how we can support developing countries towards sustainable trade and sustainable development. We are ready to strengthen our cooperation going forward. And again, I wish all the success to all of you in this endeavor, and please count with us to be a propositive and positive force on that direction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Secretary General, for those remarks and also such an expression of support for the statements and underlining the role that UNCTAD can play in supporting this work and particularly in supporting the engagement of developing countries in this endeavor, in these 3 endeavors as they go forward. I now quickly turn the floor to Crispin Conroy, who is the Geneva representative of the International Chamber of Commerce. Crispin.
Thank you, Caroline. Good morning to everybody. The International Chamber of Commerce is the institutional representative of over 45 million companies, small, medium, and large, with national committees in over 110 countries, welcomes these 3 ministerial declarations. We congratulate the co-conveners and the members, and we encourage other members to join as quickly as possible. ICC and business, as an important end user of the WTO rules, are strong supporters of the multilateral trading system. And we also therefore welcome the participation of different stakeholders, including business, in this meeting today and in the discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, plastics, and fossil fuel subsidies. ICC Secretary General John Denton noted at the launch of the TESSD initiative just over a year ago the importance of building coherence across the various multilateral agendas: trade, environment, and development. And indeed, if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, we urgently need to ensure coherence between the environmental and trade agendas and explore ways for trade to support and drive solutions to our global challenges. For example, the visionary statement on fossil fuel subsidies, which is in line with ICC's own calls to phase out these subsidies, including at the recent ICC WTO Trade for Climate Trade Dialogue, is an important development. We encourage more WTO members to sign on to this declaration in the future, as its wide adoption would make a significant difference to combating climate change. And in this context, we look forward to working with all of you to build on the recommendations of that trade dialogue event during the course of 2022. Let me conclude by reminding you that ICC Secretary General announced at the launch of TESSD in November last year his decision to commission a study on international trade and circular economy. There's an increasing interest in a more circular approach by both policymakers and business especially as an operational model to drive towards greater sustainability worldwide. And it's becoming increasingly clear that attention needs to be given to the role of trade in driving this transition. We are pleased that both the TESSD and the plastics declarations make a specific reference to circular economy. We will be presenting the study and the concrete recommendations for action at the WTO at a meeting of the TESSD initiative in early 2022. For those of you who are interested in the study and recommendations, it was released yesterday and can be found on the ICC website. We look forward to working with all delegations and other stakeholders to make progress on these three critical aspects of WTO's work program, bringing business perspectives from our global network. In the lead up to MC12 and the ICC WTO B20 Business Forum, which we hope will take place in March 2022, and of course beyond. Thank you again.
Thank you, Crispin, and excellent to hear that the international business community is so interested in this environment and trade agenda and willing to put so much energy into helping support it. We have one more speaker, and then I will turn to the Deputy Director General to close, which we should do with about 8 or 10 minutes of delay, of being late, sorry. So I'm now going to turn the floor to Mr. Marco Lambertini, who is the Director General of WWF International.
Excellencies, honorable ministers, ambassadors, distinguished delegates, and colleagues. Despite much public outcry and growing evidence of its impact, the plastic pollution crisis is showing no signs of slowing down. Plastic pollution affects both land and marine wildlife and ecosystems. It pollutes our water, soil, and air, and overburning and controlled dump sites and microplastic ingestion are causing increasing human health concerns. In a recent study, we found that the lifetime societal cost of the plastic produced in 2019 alone totals $3.7 trillion, more than the GDP of India. The economic opportunities in a circular and zero net plastic economy are very clear. Still, plastic pollution remains largely unregulated at the global level and insufficiently addressed almost everywhere in the world. The ministerial statement launched here today is an important milestone for the WTO's efforts and contribution in solving the plastic pollution crisis. The ministerial statement also sends an important signal of support ahead of the upcoming 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly. In February, UN member states will meet to adopt a mandate to start negotiations for a legally binding global treaty on plastic pollution. The new global treaty must include specific requirements and standards on products, materials, and practices, along with binding global goals on plastic reduction, collection, recycling, and alternatives. It provides a unique opportunity to harness the full potential of global common rules in our fight against plastic pollution. A shared global plan with harmonized regulations is the only way we can provide an efficient response to this global problem and to enable national governments and businesses to succeed in stopping the plastic pollution wave. Importantly, there is also growing alignment across governments, business, and civil society. Consumers around the world are signaling the readiness for change, and more than 2.1 million people are calling on their leaders to create the enabling conditions and urgently take action. More than 25 financial institutions and over 60 multinational companies globally have also called for an ambitious new treaty. And most governments, 80% of the UN membership, have officially expressed their support. We call on all governments to start negotiations on a new plastic pollution treaty at UNEA 5 and to work for an ambitious legally binding global agreement to combat plastic pollution. The WWF commends WTO's engagement on this issue and it's ready to support it. The momentum is there, the time is now, the time to turn off the tab of plastic pollution once and for all. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marco. So together, the interventions from ministers and stakeholders today are an extraordinary expression of support for the three statements and of resolve to work together to find ways forward on issues of environment, trade, and sustainable development. Together, Dr. Ngozi, ministers and stakeholders have highlighted 3 key words for work on these statements going forward: ambition, environmental credibility, and inclusiveness. They've emphasized that the time is now, and there is great hope and expectation that we can do better. So I turn now to the WTO Deputy Director General, Jean-Mathieu Palgam, to provide closing remarks and draw this event to a close.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and good morning, ministers, excellencies, colleagues, and those following us virtually today. I would just like to thank the co-conveners for inviting me to offer some concluding remarks. And first of all, as our Director General and several of you observed this morning, this is a historic moment for the WTO. The fact that more than 80 co-sponsors across the 3 statements represent 86% of global trade demonstrates, if needed be, that the WTO can and must be playing a role on an environmental issue. Now, obviously, we know that as we celebrate the launch of the 3 ministerial declaration, it's important to recognize that the work is just a beginning. And since this is the season of wishes, I would like to make 3 wishes about the future of this work. The first one is that I really wish that the 3 undertaking that we are launching now will very much draw on the contributions of their stakeholders, the one we heard today, partners from international organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector. Why is that important? Because what is being engaged today is not merely about correcting some marginal negative environmental impact from trade. What is being engaged today is aiming at turning international trade into a force supporting the fundamental transition of the world economy towards sustainability. This is a reorganization of business practices and a market economy of itself as such. And at the level of each enterprise, getting rid of plastic pollution or driving down carbon emission will require a fundamental transformation of every business function: the design of goods and services, the finance, the supply management, the production, the distribution. And the private sector is already gearing up for this transformation. International organizations and coalitions, which have been mentioned, are also bringing into it a lot of input and innovative solutions. So the role of the initiatives which are being taken today is to drill down this input and turn it into concrete trade action. My second wish is that the 3 ministerial declarations will soon lead to creative and pragmatic results. Creativity will be really needed because negotiators may have to move beyond the classical give and take, the negotiating techniques that the WTO has inherited from the GATT. Delivering public good will require looking at the negotiation with a fresh eyes and try to look for the common wins beyond the mere exchange of trade concession. Achieving a global public good will require bringing positive members' contribution in new ways and configuration. And pragmatism will be also of the matter to envisage results not only in terms of classical trade agreements, but also having in mind the full array of tools that can contribute to international cooperation and to shaping sustainable trade outcomes. I'm talking about dissemination of best practices, voluntary guidelines, technical assistance, legal commitments, public-private partnership, all this array which is in the toolbox. Thirdly, I really want to wish that the 3 undertaking will take full benefits from the diversity of their members. We know that the raison d'etre is the pursuit of and delivery of global public goods, and it's important to recognize, it has been said this morning, that not all WTO members have the same capacity to move at the same speed. And we all know that by its very nature, the objective of sustainable development entails a just transition toward a sustainable economy. By joining hands across these 3 environmental endeavors, developing and developed countries can offer new and constructive trade solutions that I'm sure can work for all and bridge any geopolitical divide or lack of trust. This is what will ensure that the progress made will also benefit members that are not yet involved at this stage and invite them and convince them to join. As you can judge from my 3 wishes, I think that the discussions that you are undertaking today have the great potential of being a full-size laboratory for some aspects of the WTO of the future. Too much of a dream? I don't think so, if one realizes how far we have traveled already in changing the paradigm. The question in the WTO have already changed from how to derogate from trade rules to pursue environmental objectives to how can trade make a positive contribution to the environment. With such an inspiration for the future in mind, I'd wish to congratulate again the co-sponsor, thank Caroline for her moderation, and the three ministerial statements co-conveners. They provide, I think, an invaluable foundation for the important work that lies ahead. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm being put in charge of bringing the event to a close, so I bring the event to a close if everybody agrees. Thank you again and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.